Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Wigtown Book Festival, this year online for the first time. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Anne Brown, and I'm going to be in conversation with Professor Dame Sue Black. But first, I'd just like to thank the Costanza Trust, who are supporting this event, and point out the buttons on the sites where you may be watching this. You can ask questions, make comments, make donations if you'd like to help us keep the festival going, and of course, buy the books. It's a welcome return to the festival for this evening's guest. She won the hearts of everyone in a packed marquee when she came to talk about her first book, All That Remains, 2 years ago. And now it's a delight and a privilege to have her back digitally with her wonderful new book, Written in Bone. And there it is. And there's the other one. They make a very good match set, don't you think? Sue Black is a leading forensic anthropologist, well known and respected across the world. Now at Lancaster University, for many years she was Professor of Anatomy and Forensic Anthropology at the University of Dundee and Director of the Centre for Anatomy and Human Identification. She's led teams in Kosovo and in Thailand, and her meticulous investigations have been crucial to a number of high-profile cases. Written in Bone takes us on a journey through our bones from the top of our heads to the tips of our toes and explain how everything about our lives may be discovered there. Sue describes the job of the forensic anthropologist as not to create a life story, but to try and find and understand the story that's already been written large in its bones, muscles, skin, tendons, and the very fibre of its being. That's surely quite a task. So very big welcome, Sue. It is so good to see you here again.
Thank you, and you're so kind. And it is always a pleasure to come to Wigtown. And I just wish I was there rather than sitting in my office.
So do we all. But can we start, do you think? You've probably been asked this loads of times before, but please could you start by briefly explaining the difference between a forensic anthropologist and a forensic pathologist, because they both seem to do the same sort of identification.
They do in part. So in the UK, a forensic pathologist is generally medically qualified and then trained in pathology before they train in forensic pathology. Forensic anthropologists in the UK are generally scientists. So where the differentiation comes is a forensic pathologist will focus primarily on the manner of death and the cause of death, and the forensic anthropologist is focusing on who was the person when they were alive. So we're an identification science as opposed to somebody who is establishing a cause or a manner of death.
Well, I hope that's clear to everybody. Anyway, Written in Bones is wonderful. It follows beautifully on to All That Remains. We really learn about our skeletons in this book. And actually, I thought I knew the names of most of my bones. But as you list the proper clinical names for them all, I find I'm much more ignorant about anatomy than I thought I was. Why did you decide to be so detailed about that and give all the proper names?
And I think you've just explained it. It's because we live inside our bodies for the entirety of our life. And most of us actually know very little about what goes on inside and where the different things are and what they're called. And that lexicon, that language that is in anatomy is, of course, the language that is used by our doctors and by our hospitals. And I think a lot of people feel at times a little bamboozled by the words that a medic might use. And so I thought it was an opportunity to bring anatomy into the field of everyday language so that people can help to understand. I don't know if you remember in the Generation game when Bruce Forsyth used to front it, there used to be one of those things that they did where they put up a cutout of the body and the contestants had to draw along where they thought their stomach was or their kidneys or their liver. And they were always in the wrong place and they were always the wrong size. But that's just an indication of the fact that we know so little, most of us, about what goes on inside our body. And I just thought it was a great opportunity to be able to talk about it.
So just as everything's inside, and as long as it's behaving itself, we're quite happy.
Pretty much. But just being able to know that when a medic throws a term at you, if you've heard it before, it's less threatening. And so it is just about that process of sometimes getting words out there.
So we start at the top of our heads, where the fontanelle is in little babies, and you describe all the different places where bones fuse as we grow older. When is the human skeleton actually complete, finished growing?
When you die.
Really?
Simple as that. So that we think that the human skeleton is this dry, dusty, sort of dead thing of bone, because we're used to seeing archaeological skeletons, which are dry and dead bone. But human bone is a live organ. So if you cut it, it hurts. If you cut it, it bleeds. If you break it, it remolds itself. And right the way throughout the entirety of your life, from before you're born till the moment you die, the skeleton is constantly replenishing itself. So it's whether you think of growth as being something that is growth in terms of your length, or you think about growth in terms of the bone turning over, it's actually just until the moment of your death that it keeps going. And that's why I love the human skeleton. Everything about it is that it forms so early on in the life, before mum even knows she's pregnant, your bones are forming inside her uterus.
That was something I found really interesting, was all the way through the book, you explain when this particular bone was forming in the womb and how bits start, and by 3 weeks it's so and so. And I found that riveting. Do you think that this is something that will change the way people look at the bones and the way that the fetus and the baby grows?
Well, I hope they'll think about their own health, because you have to think there's a very good reason why on a plane they say put on your own oxygen mask before you help anyone else. If you're going to look after the baby that's growing inside you, you have to be kind to yourself, because everything that you do as a mum impacts upon that little thing that's growing inside you. And as those bones form, the only place those bones can take their nutrients from are from the things you as mum eat. And when you make that direct link, I think that that's a really powerful statement. And there's so much of the human body has formed before mum even knows she's pregnant. And to me, that's always been the most marvelous miracle.
It is amazing. How many bones do we have altogether?
Well, you see, I'm a scientist, so I'm never going to give you an absolute number. It always says it depends. But we say that on average, the adult skeleton has about 206 bones. If you're looking at a newborn child, it's considerably more than that, because what becomes a single bone in the adult, in the child, can be made up of separate parts before they fuse together. So forensic anthropology, when looking at a skeleton of a child, might be looking at 500 different bone bits to be able to try and identify it. It's like a huge human jigsaw.
Now, obviously, it's not something that can be studied in individual people very much before they're dead. So what sort of things can you learn from people's bones when they're dead?
One of the things about the book, I was asked, because one of my areas of expertise is in criminal dismemberment. And so I was asked, if this was a part of the body that was given to you, what could you tell from it? And that's why the book is separated out into these different sections. It's about saying, if all I had were the long bones, if all I had were the chest bones, if all I had was the spinal cord, what could you tell from it? And because you never know in a case what part of a body you're going to be presented with, especially if it's a dismemberment case, then you have to be able to extract every single bit of information out of every single bone that you can. And some bones will tell you a different bit of the story compared to others. So the more complete the skeleton, then the more complete is the story of your life. But if all we have is a single bone, then we may only be able to get small little snapshots of it. So we might be able to tell whether you were male or female, how old you were when you died, maybe what height you were, or maybe what your ancestral origin was. And they construct a really sort of broad brush approach that says, a male, age between 25 and 30, 5'8" to 5'10" in height, and probably white. Then that gives you an image. It doesn't tell you who that person is, but it does say if you know those 4 characteristics, you can search a missing persons database, and you will get a list of the people who will fit those criteria. Then you could go away and you can start to investigate each and every one of those, and to hopefully then get down to the point of confirming an identity. But sometimes it might just be a single bone or a fragment of bone that has got you there.
Are there some bones that give you more information than others, or do you have favorite ones and you think, yes, I've got this is going to help?
Depends on, again, I hate to say it depends, but it depends on the question you're asking. So if what's really critical, it usually is this male or female? Because that determination will exclude 50% of the people on a missing persons database. So if I want to determine the sex of an individual, then I'm really happy if I have a piece of the pelvis or I have a piece of the skull. If I want to be really accurate in the determination of the age of a child, then there are particular long bones that I want to have because they are really very good at age prediction. So you can go into a shop and you can buy a pair of trousers for an 8-year-old or for a 10-year-old. You can't buy them for a 45-year-old. So that, the length of the bones is no good when you get older, but is much more valuable when it's younger. So there's no one bone that has greater value than any other. It just depends on the question you're asking of it.
You seem to like clavicles.
Oh, I love clavicles. Clavicles are beautiful bones. The collarbone. They're the first bone to form in the fetus. So before mum even knows, that bit of bone is forming. And it forms from a different type of bone. So the result is that it survives really well. So whether a body is buried in the ground or in an explosion or in a fire, it's a really dense bone. And so it usually persists. And it grows in the fetus at a very, very regular rate. And it grows at a really fairly regular rate right the way through until you're in your mid-20s. And by mid-20s, it's just starting to end its growth. And that means that as a bone, you have this wonderful window of opportunity for age determination. And it's great for sex determination as well. You can even calculate your height from it. So, it tells us most of the things that we want to hear. So a clavicle is for us usually a good sign.
You said that the bones that are finished sort of growing have a sort of cap at the end. How does that work?
So if you imagine when you have a chicken, so you're having your Sunday lunch, and anatomists always relate everything to food. We can't get away from it. At the end of a young chicken, you have that gristle, that cartilage. And that cartilage allows the bone to grow. So if you think about your thigh bone, what you have is a long shaft in the middle, and then you have 2 little points of cartilage, and then you have 2 other little bits of bone at either end. And that cartilage keeps the bone growing so that it keeps getting longer and longer and longer. But eventually, once you get towards the end of puberty, what happens is the bone grows faster than the cartilage does. So those 2 layers of bone now start to get closer and closer together as the cartilage diminishes in size, and eventually they fuse. And when they fuse, your bones aren't going to get any longer.
And what you refer to as the long bones, arms and legs, are they?
So they're the bones that form the arm. So the arm is from your shoulder to your elbow, and the forearm is from your elbow to your wrist. The whole thing is an upper limb. So anatomists would never call this an arm. It's an upper limb. That's the arm, and then the forearm down to the wrist. In the lower limb, then from the hip to the knee is the thigh, and from the knee to the ankle is the leg.
They're the ones that seem to give you problems as you grow older.
Unfortunately, those joints do, yes.
I was very interested, actually, when you were talking about the foot and what it's for and how much it has to do. And when you look at the bones in the foot, there's so many the sort of little bones. How do they cope with it all?
So I hate feet. I really hate, I think feet are the most horrible things. You know, they get really ugly, I'm afraid, as we get older, and they smell and they do all sorts of things that are totally antisocial. But my goodness me, do you need them? And it's only when they start to break down that you begin to appreciate your feet, and by then it's too late. So I think the people who know the importance of feet are people like nurses, because they're on their feet all the time. And I've never known anybody who looks after their feet probably better than nurses, or maybe soldiers, because they know how critical they are to every aspect of our life. If we have that mobility, the feet are important. And because there are so many bones in there, as almost as many as we have in a hand, then being able to identify each and every one of them is really important. When there's a huge volume of bone in there, they can tell us a lot of information about how we walk, about who we were, what sort of a stance we had. All of those sorts of things are written in there inside their feet. But what's also interesting about feet is we put them inside socks and then we put them inside shoes. So that when a body decomposes, they actually get protected. And so when the body is dismembered, perhaps, you know, if a body is lying outside, foxes or cats or dogs will dismember, often the feet get very well preserved. And if a body is in water as it's decomposing, then the shoes, which can often be trainers, act as flotation devices. So we frequently find feet washed up on shores, isolated from the rest of the body, but kept contained because they're in their own little box. So they become really useful sometimes for identification.
In criminal cases, it's sometimes the case where you might find bones separated from each other. How do you then build the picture?
It's very difficult. So the first thing you have to do is to be able to identify what's in front of you. And we ask a number of questions of it. Is it bone? Because it's amazing how much in a fire, for example, will look like bone but isn't. So is it bone? If it's bone, is it human bone? Because if it's not human bone, we're really not very interested in it. But if it is human bone, where does it come from? And so it means that we have to be able to identify every fragment of the human skeleton from the point at which it forms right the way through until it reaches our adult form and beyond in its fragmented state. And then being able to say, okay, it's a bit of a femur. Here's another bit of a femur. Is it the same femur? So is the age or the sex or the other profile of that bone saying the same thing? Can I legitimately put them together? And then do they fit together? Because if it's from a different person, they don't ever fit together perfectly because your joints are designed to fit only your joints. And so we reconstruct pieces of the jigsaw, first of all, before we can reconstruct the jigsaw itself. It's just one of those wonderfully painstaking processes where you're doing a jigsaw that's upside down with no picture and no reference, but you're trying to reconstruct what the person would have been or who the person would have been in their life.
I mean, one of those cases were the sort of bag of bones that the limbs in the Loch, in Loch Lomond, where you found bits of the person who'd been killed by William Beggs. Tell us about that one.
That was one of those cases where the police are constantly training. So whatever unit they may be, they always go on training exercises. This was the diving unit. And the diving unit were training off Loch Lomond. So they jumped off the pier and went down. And just at the bottom of the pier, they found these black plastic bags. And they assumed that they'd been placed there as part of their training. So they went down, collected them, brought them back up again. And it was only when they opened them that they realized that what they had were real human body parts. And so clicked instantly from being, this is not a training exercise, actually this is a live event. And we were asked to go and have a look at the remains, and they were just the limbs at this stage. We didn't have a head and we didn't have a torso. And often you find that the head and the torso are the areas of the body that are most likely to give you information about a manner or a cause of death. because they're large surface areas and they're usually the area where you're going to find injuries, whether they are ballistic, sharp force trauma, blunt force trauma. So from the limbs, what we were asking was, who could this person be? And so we were able to look at those limbs and say they were from a male, and we could determine that simply because the limbs have not been in the Loch very long. And so we could see the classic hair patterning, particularly on the thigh, that you would not expect to find in a female body. We could determine the age because the individual showed that although all the bones had finished growing, it hadn't been very long since they had stopped growing. So this put somebody into their late teens or into their early 20s. We could calculate his height because we had the length of his legs. And of course, we could see from the skin colour what was likely to be his ancestry. So you can then say to the police, this is the profile of who you're looking for in your missing person database. And of course, they came up with a hit. And we said it's going to be somebody who's been reported missing very recently because there is very little element of decomposition. And that's how they were able to come up with the identification. From then, through DNA, you can then start to piece, where was this person? When were they last seen? You can then go and talk to their family, their colleagues, their friends, and you start to piece together what was the history that led up to these limbs appearing in the Loch. At a later date, the torso was found, and then at a much later date, the head was found. And the head was found on a beach in Ayrshire, and that was because Banks had probably thrown the head overboard from the ferry as he'd been heading across to Ireland. So it's what I talk about in the classic dismemberment, being able to bring the pieces together. And only when you have the pieces can the police start to investigate what might have happened. So our involvement in the case stops when we've extracted as much information about who the person may have been. It then becomes the police responsibility to investigate what's happened and the pathologist's responsibility to determine how the individual lost their life.
You do have some fairly gruesome stories in this book. I mean, you're talking about a good hanging, you talk about torture, kneecapping, and about murders and some of the dreadful things that are done deliberately to people, and the tools or implements that they use. Are you surprised by anything anymore?
I suppose what surprises me more than anything is that in adversity, there is boundless kindness. And what I mean by that is when you have people who have gone through things that you and I would never, ever want to experience in our lifetime, in our families, what you find in the people that you work with is an inordinate ability to empathize, to go that extra mile, to find the kindness. What you don't focus on is what you said, which is the gruesomeness of the case. To actually be able to function in a world like that, you have to look for the light rather than allow yourself to be consumed by the darkness. And I've always found that wherever you are in the world, whatever it is that you're involved in, there's something that makes you realize the human spirit is the most wonderful and absolutely wondrous thing.
So how would you describe a good hanging? How can a hanging be good?
So I will put it in context there, because we were talking about hangings in relation to when in a past time we had executions as a result, and hanging was one of those things that were an outcome if you were found guilty of a number of crimes. And of course, we no longer have these judicial hangings. But it was viewed as being, if you had a swift death, then that was a good hanging. And that was why there was the calculation of what was the correct drop. And so there was a real science behind the drop of a hanging. What was the weight of the person to be hanged? What was the drop of rope that you required them to actually, when the trapdoor opened, that they were going to fall, so that death was as swift as possible. Because if it wasn't done properly, then it was asphyxiation that caused you. It wasn't the hanging as such where you would expect it to be instantaneous because you'd be crushed through the spinal cord, people often suffocated and therefore choked to death. And so they would be left often with real awareness of what was happening for minutes, which was really not a good death. And it was why in historical times you would often pay people to run forward and to pull on the hanged person's legs so that you could hasten the execution, so that death wasn't something that was so protracted. So a good hanging was viewed as a swift hanging that had a minimum amount of stress.
So a hangman was actually a very skilled operator.
Well, they should have been, and we had very many who were skilled. It was considered a bad hanging if the person didn't die swiftly, and an even worse hanging if, in fact, the drop was so great that the head and the body separated, as would sometimes happen. And that was considered to be a bad hanging as well. So a hangman was often judged on their ability.
There's one heartbreaking story, actually, about a little boy that made me cry. And I don't want to go into all the details of the abuse he'd suffered. But you were asked to try and establish a timeline for his injuries. How do you go about that? How do you establish when particular injuries happen?
So I will keep it very superficial because it is very challenging. Some of the cases are very challenging. But it was a young child who had gone through a significant number of physical insults to his body. And because the human skeleton is something that keeps changing, then we can determine in some cases whether fractures are very recent and may have occurred around the time of death. That's because there is no evidence that the bone has tried to heal itself. If, in fact, what we see is healing, then we can suggest that the injury happened a number of days or weeks before. And it's the grade of healing. So that when a bone breaks, what you get is you form a callus around it. And that's just a soft tissue callus initially. It's like a bit of sticking plaster that goes across the cut ends of bone to try and keep them together. And the healing that you see is very minimal to start with, but then as it progresses, it gets more extensive healing. And so you can gauge whether it's something recent or something that happened a very long time ago.
And is that the same process by which you can determine whether bone damage, fractures, or whatever have taken place before, during, or after death?
So we have three categories: what we call antemortem, which is before death; perimortem, which means around death; or postmortem, which means after death. And if you have a twig and you snap it, an old dry twig snaps freely, and that's postmortem fracture. A twig that is quite green, when you snap it, often what you get is ragged bits. And that tells us that fracture happened around the time of death. But if there's some healing, then we know it happened sometime before death.
It's a very exacting science. Do some bones break more easily than others?
Some do. So there are some that are really in a position where it's bad news. So that if you fall and you fracture your collarbone, there's a major blood vessel sitting right underneath there. If you snap it, you run the risk of penetrating that big vessel. And then, you're in trouble because there's a huge amount of blood loss going to happen. And the collarbone is one of the most frequently fractured bones that we have because we fall on an outstretched arm. But if you are in advancing age, and more frequently if you're female, then you will find fracturing of the vertebral column because of osteoporosis. You will find fracturing in the neck of the thigh bone, and also fracturing at the wrist if you fall. So bones become more brittle with age, and you're more likely to have a fracture that will be caused by something that would have been inconsequential to you when you were in your 20s, but in your 80s, it becomes a really serious clinical injury.
And bones do become a bit more fragile as you get older, I think, don't they?
Yes, they do. Yes, they do. And they're more likely to fracture.
What about brittle bones? Is that something that's with somebody all their life?
So if you have any of the brittle bone syndromes, then usually that's something that you're aware of from a very early age. Children tend to, when they fall, not break their bones most of the time. But when you have a child who has a brittle bone syndrome or any of the syndromes that are associated with brittle bones, they have frequent fractures. And it's really important that the clinician is aware that, a child who presents with frequent fracturing may be about a clinical condition, or it might be an indicator that this is a child that is suffering significant ongoing abuse. Being able to separate both is extremely important, and that's why the pediatricians are so skilled in that ability to tell the difference.
It must be a very, very difficult fine line to travel, that one.
But what an important line as well.
Absolutely. Sue, how long does evidence remain within bones? How long can you go back? I mean, if you watch programs like Silent Witness or Waking the Dead, you would think that this information lasts forever and ever and ever. But does it?
Sometimes. So if you think, we have, for example, some beautiful specimens of neonatal remains, newborn babies from Roman times. So, bone can survive for centuries. And for as long as that bone survives, there is a chance that some of the information that you laid down whilst you're alive remains in that bone. So being able to tell from Roman bones, we can't tell you whether they're male or female because we can't tell the difference in children's bones just by looking at them, but we could tell that they were newborn babies. And it depends what it is that you're looking for. But archaeology, there's a huge amount of information we can tell from bones that are centuries old, not just weeks, months, or years, but centuries old.
Because it is the last bit of us that's left, isn't it?
It is. It's the last sentinel of our mortal existence, our bones and our teeth. They survive better than any other part, unless you are in something like a peat bog. So if you were buried in a peat bog, because that's an acidic environment, actually what that does is the bones leach away. So they almost dissolve, and you're left with a soft tissue. And so it's a bit like tanning, the way you tan hides. The soft tissue survives, but the bone goes. So it's very much dependent on the environment in which the body is buried.
Interesting. So obviously the police consult you and call you in on criminal cases. Do you ever get consulted by the makers of programs such as Silent Witness?
Yes, all the time. And you usually know when they're heading towards that point of submitting their proposals to production companies, because you get a flurry of, we really want to produce a program, and can we follow you? And, you have to say to them, look, the reality is that I might have a case every single day for a week, and I might have nothing else for 6 months. So if you want to sit in my office watching me do paperwork for the university, knock yourselves out. But it isn't the kind of job that has that periodicity that allows you to follow us. So we have to often make them a little bit more realistic about our potential of what we can do to assist. But I get great fun out of being able to help crime writers, for example. So when they are writing their stories, often they will get in touch with me and say, is this right? Does that sound as if that could actually happen? And I have a great respect for the crime writers in that regard, because they want what they write to be as realistic as they can possibly manage. And that tells me they have respect for their readers. And so I get a sort of vicarious pleasure of working into fiction some of the knowledge that I have to help others write their stories.
So have you ever thought of using any of this knowledge to write fiction yourself?
No, I don't think I have the skills to write fiction. And I think fiction is a really difficult thing. Anyone who's trying to write it, I'm sure, will say that. Ensuring you've got characters that people like, ensuring that you've got a pace throughout that story, that it's unfolding in a way that keeps people's attention. I don't think I have those skills or the imagination to write fiction. And, as I'm sure a lot of people know, Val McDermott is a very, very dear friend of mine. And she's quite relieved. She says, good, don't write fiction because we don't need you in competition. I just don't have the incredible skills that a fiction writer does, and I respect that enormously.
Of course, you and she started the morgue together, didn't you?
We did a long time ago when I needed to raise £1 million for a new morgue, and we came up with £1 million for a morgue idea, and we had so much fun for a number of years raising money and raising awareness. And one of the things that we didn't anticipate at the time was, in talking about body donation and anatomy departments, was just how much people would come up to us and say, how do I do it? I didn't know you still needed bodies for teaching. And that for us was a real wake-up call. We hadn't realised that because we don't talk about death enough, people didn't realise that we still needed their help.
We were saying earlier that obviously the police come to you to consult you about different things, but in fact governments do as well, don't they, sometimes? There was one story I absolutely loved in the book, was when you were asked to go to Grenada. Can you tell us about that? And about the difference between the American and the British teams?
I don't want to spoil it for everyone who might go and read it. But when you are sent abroad, often you are not always given the full amount of information that you need. And it was to look at some remains that had been found in a graveyard that had a particular political relevance. And the Americans, the FBI and the military, were asked to go out as the primary team. And the UK was asked to send somebody as an observer that we made sure that we could report back in terms of what was found. And there were two of us that were sent out from the UK, myself and a forensic pathologist. And we arrived looking very much like, there I was, a grandmother, effectively, and him looking like somebody like, I say, from a man from Del Monte in his slacks and his sort of Panama hat. And the FBI turned up, fully jacketed, full, baseball caps. They had the boots, they had the wonderful, flashy equipment, and the sort of metal suitcases. And it was a bit like Dad's Army meets the X-Files. It was about the only way that I could describe it. And they looked at us and they decided that we were absolutely no threat to them whatsoever, and they could ignore us. And that is just the most wonderfully delicious place to be, because it means that you can actually work in a very different environment. And we had a bit of fun, I have to say, at the expense of the American team. But I think at the end of it all, I don't want to give away the details, but at the end of it all, I think we've reached the position of respect.
Good.
Which we didn't have at the outset, but I think we'd achieved by the end. And it was memorable. It was wonderfully memorable.
It's a lovely story in the book, that's for sure. Sue, let's talk a little bit about DNA, because everything we read these days, it's investigation, and DNA gives the police or the investigators the answers. Does that mean that maybe your skills and those coming after you won't be as necessary?
No, I think our skills have changed. So when Alec Jeffreys from Leicester had his eureka moment, where he couldn't get his research to work and he couldn't figure out why he couldn't get his research to work, and it was because that was the moment when he realised everybody's DNA was different. That changed forensic science forever. And so a lot of the cases that we might have been involved in before DNA, now we don't need to be. So our cases tend to be the ones that aren't being resolved. So we're at the more difficult end of the spectrum than where we would have been in the 1980s. And so it's not necessarily different skills that are required, it's a different set of cases that are now coming to us. But if you imagine, in your DNA, your name and your address are not sewn into that double helix. And so we can't look at your DNA and say, this is Anne Brown's DNA, because we don't know it's yours. And our only databases are criminal databases primarily. So unless you've been convicted of a crime, We don't hold your DNA profile anywhere. So even if we extract that DNA, we've nothing to match it with. And if the police can't find out who you are, we can't investigate it. So DNA takes us so far down the route, it doesn't take us all the way. So the skills are still needed.
Well, the questions have been piling in.
Yes.
So let's just see what we've got here. Somebody called Katrina says, my Scottish children, nieces and nephews, grew most during sunny holidays. Why was this? More vitamin D? If they'd been brought up in Africa, would they have been taller?
So there is a seasonality to growth, and we do grow more in the summer months than we grow in the winter months. There's a biochemical reason for it, but it is also about exercise, and it is all about diet as well. But there is a really important genetic composition to growth as well. So just simply going to Africa isn't necessarily going to change that, because your genetics will have an ultimate leveler on it. But there is no doubt, absolutely none whatsoever, you will grow more in the summer in our climate than you certainly will in the winter.
And there's one from Ian who says, you said you can determine the gender from particular bones, and transgender issues are currently very much in the public consciousness. Can a bone be transgender?
So what I said was I can determine sex from a bone, and sex and gender can be two very different things. So most of the time what we're looking at in terms of sex determination is about the genetic sex of the individual. And that is influenced, it's influenced primarily by circulating levels of hormones. And most of us will go through to adulthood with a particular biochemical focus and direction. So primarily we will either have testosterone or estrogen as the principal hormone that is going through our bodies. When we are adults, people can choose to change those hormones. So we might be genetically male, but choose to take female hormones, or vice versa. And it's then that we start to see gender differences. And there are certain parts of the body, if they keep changing after we've reached adulthood, where you can pick that up. And one area is in the cartilage of our chest bone. So the space between our ribs and our breastbone are cartilage, and they lay down bone as we get older. If the circulating hormone, predominant hormone, is testosterone, we get a particular type of bone that we say looks like crab claws. And if it's estrogen, we get a particular type of bone that looks like strings of pearls. So when you look at a chest plate, and the genetics of the body are saying to me this is female, but I look at the chest plate of the adult and say, but I've got really strong indicators of male, then I will say, I think you need to check whether this is somebody who could be either transgender or is transgendering at the time between. It's never exact.
So the hormone changes will show up in the bone?
In the cartilage more than in the bone, yes.
Okay. Anne asks, does your work make you very aware of the fragility of the human body or its resilience?
I think it's wonderfully resilient. It's amazing what the human body can endure and adapt to as well. So it's the adaptation of the human body that I find fascinating. And when you look at it, our life expectancy is 83 if you're female and 79 if you're male in the UK. That's an incredible expectation. Now, not everybody reaches that. Of course they don't. It is an expectation. And there are times when it is amazing just how something almost inconsequential can end a life that makes you feel that life was incredibly fragile. But by and large, it's more durable than it is fragile.
And Andrew, which sort of almost follows on from that, says, has studying the human body made you think beyond flesh and bone to spirit, soul, love that remains beyond the remains, if you like?
All the time, because for me, death is the end of a physical body, or maybe not, because in my world it can go on a little bit longer. But for most people, the death of a parent, the death of a child, that particular physicality stops at that point. But what doesn't stop is the love that's in your heart and the memories that are in your head. And one of the most important people to me growing up was my grandmother. And I will be the last person alive who remembers my grandmother. And so I have this certain completion of a circle that says when I die, actually my grandmother then dies with me, because I will be the only person left who remembers her. But of course, the stunning irony is that having written about her, it's amazing then how you have a longevity.
Yes.
And for anybody who read All That Remains, in there I talk about Arthur. And Arthur was the gentleman who was determined to end his own life in his own way. And I'm sad to say that he did that just 2 weeks ago. And so I was able to attend his funeral. And I put it out there on Twitter when he did die. And the number of responses that I got back from people saying, we'd always wondered if Arthur was still alive, what had happened to him. He touched us. And it shows that if you write it down, then people can actually live longer in the consciousness of others.
Yeah.
That's why writing is so important.
Jeff, somebody called Jeff says, how can we best look after our bones as we get older?
It is about diet and it's about exercise. So it is, keep yourself active as much as you can and make sure that your diet is as healthy as it possibly can be. Now, I know that's really not interesting and, it sounds terribly constricting, but you do get to a point, I think, in life where, you've got to ask, does it matter anymore? So when my father reached into his 80s and he had dreadful dementia, and we went into the care home, did it matter if he wanted a huge amount of double cream with his pudding? It didn't, because what it brought was a smile to his face. And I do think, there comes a point where you've done as much as you can, you then have that decision of, can I have those luxuries now? But I might have denied myself earlier. And the answer surely has to be yes. What's the question? Well, the answer is cake. Yes.
Cake with everything, absolutely.
Absolutely.
I haven't got any cake in the house. I've been so good over lockdown. And I've actually, one question asks how you have managed the pandemic. Have you been able to work? What have you been doing?
So I am in Lancaster at the moment. So I'm in my office at the moment, but I have been at home in Scotland for most of lockdown. So I've been very lucky to be with my family. The university has turned itself on its head. And so I find myself in front of a screen, probably for about 10 to 12 hours of a day, which is not great because it's not good for your posture, it's not good for your eyesight, it's really not good for anything. And so being back on campus and being able today to go for a cup of coffee with colleagues has been the most wonderful luxury. Things that we took for granted in February are no longer taken for granted. I think we need to remember that, the things that are important.
Somebody called Amber says, can you tell if someone is Scottish by their bones?
That would come down to DNA and it would come down to stable isotopes. So if we're able to extract DNA from the bone, then we will be able to tell roughly where somebody was in terms of their northern hemisphere. Doesn't narrow them down to Scotland. But if you can look at the stable isotopes, so your bones are made up of the things you eat. You are what you eat. And we think that we have a terribly cosmopolitan diet, but actually we don't. Much of it is actually quite local, and especially the water that we drink. So very clever people like Wolfram Meyer-Augenstein, brilliant name, who is a stable isotopes expert, he will be able to look at the composition of nitrogen and oxygen in your bone, and he will be able to say this is likely somebody who's been living in a particular part of Scotland because of that stable isotope ratio. So people much cleverer than me will be able to give that answer, and I would always pass it to him to say, what do you think?
Fiona here says, fantastic presentation and books, Sue. Are you going to make a TV program again?
Oh, I hope not. So I have the perfect face for radio. And I hate being on television. I really hate it. And we did 8 episodes of a series called History Cold Case. And at one point they said to me, can you look cross? And I didn't have to act. So I'm really never, ever destined to be in front of a camera. I find the continuous having to retake. I have got such a small attention span that I lose interest in it very, very quickly. So I leave that to the professionals. I'd rather do radio than do
Well, there's another question there that said, did you enjoy recording the audiobooks? You're a fabulous narrator with a lovely reading voice.
Well, that's very kind, but I have to say I didn't enjoy that either. I sound like the most miserable, curmudgeonly person on the planet. But there are 2 reasons I didn't like it. One is that, you know, you're reading what you've written, and as an academic, I want to have a red pen in my hand going, should have said that, I could have said that. My goodness me, I split an infinitive. So I hated that. And because you have to talk for so long, by the end of it, your tongue is actually sore. And so it's not the best experience. But I think it's important because there are words in there that somebody who's written it can say with more conviction than somebody who's coming to it cold. So I thought it was important to do, but I'm not convinced I'm the best person to have done it.
We haven't got very long left, but there are 1 or 2 things I'd like to still talk to you about. You talk about real human bones sometimes being used in a keyring or as jewellery.
Yeah.
How on earth do you come across those?
Well, the case in the keyring was literally a keyring that was found with human finger bones on it. And it was a young man in an accident who'd actually had his finger taken off with a saw. And for some reason, he'd managed to persuade the local hospital to allow him to have his finger back. And he processed his own finger to put it onto a keyring. Why anybody would do that, I have no idea, but he did. But there is a sort of increasing trend in people creating jewellery out of archaeological bone. And I find that offensive, because if somebody was to create jewellery out of my grandmother's remains or my great-grandmother's remains, I would object to that. And I think most people would. So why is it okay for us to think it's okay to buy somebody else's remains on the internet and have it created into jewellery? Have a false phone, don't have a real one.
Although you had somebody's vertebrae on your desk, I think, didn't you?
That was as an anatomical specimen, and that was William Berry, who was the last man to be hanged in Dundee. And he, in the sort of 1800s, and during the postmortem, obviously his bones, his neck bones, had been retained by the anatomy department, and it showed a good hanging because his bones had fractured, so his death was probably swift. And because they were so important, because they could be attributed to an individual, we always wanted to keep them safe. And so, yes, he sat in my office, but that was as an anatomist who held an anatomical license to hold human remains. It's certainly not to make jewellery of them.
I was just also intrigued to read that amputated limbs can't be cremated. Why not?
That's if they're in isolation.
All right.
So, if what you have is an amputated leg or an amputated arm, they go into clinical waste. And in general, you can't have a funeral for your arm or a funeral for your leg. There is a move, certainly in some religious sectors, actually to have that limb recognised, because there's a requirement within the doctrine of that religion to have that happen. But by and large, if you have a limb amputated, it goes to clinical waste and it's incinerated.
Right. And finally, I have a comment from a retired police officer.
Oh dear.
Who got in touch with me today because he knew I was going to be talking to you. And he said, do you know how much your input on the development of training and preparation of the emergency services was known about and understood. And he said that getting you to bring about the needed changes was a delight that he only became aware of whilst reading the book.
Oh, bless. We, as a group, we were aware that the UK was not prepared for a response to a mass fatality event. And in the year that we became aware that we needed to do something, which is in 2005, was the year in which we had the London bombings, we had Hurricane Katrina, we had Thailand was still ongoing. It was an incredible year where the skills were needed. And being able to use those incidences to make sure that we could have a preparedness, I think was incredibly important. And the training that we did at Dundee, one of the loveliest quotes that was ever given to me by a police officer said, we knew that the training was fit for purpose because it wasn't designed by the police force. And I thought, that sounds a very sort of backhanded compliment. But what they meant was that we could bring in the resources and the expertise from so many different areas that there was suddenly an awareness of everybody's job and what they needed to do in that kind of mass event. And I think that was a breakthrough in the way in which training was done.
Well, it was obviously deeply appreciated.
Well, that's very kind. Thank you.
And sadly, we've come to the end, Sue. I could talk to you for hours. Here is the book again, everybody. Written in Bone. It's wonderful. It makes a brilliant follow-up to the other one. And I do recommend that you all now click on your buying button and buy it from the Wigtown Book Festival, because everything you buy from our shop does help us to keep the festival going. I now have to thank you, Sue, so much. It's been an absolute joy and a delight to talk to you again. And thank you very much indeed for being part of this.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. It is always a delight to speak with you. And thank you for having me into your studio.
Many thanks. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye.